Our Justice Thursday conversation is around things that are currently happening, and we're asking the questions around the legalese on all of this. Getting into that conversation and joining us in the hot seat this morning is Charles Kanjama, Advocate of the High Court. Good morning, Wakili.
Good morning to you, and it's a pleasure to be here. It's a bright early morning, and I'm delighted to be with you and with your team.
The sun is shining, the birds are chirping, all those good things. Indeed. It's a Justice Thursday conversation. We're looking into the legality of the panel of compensation and the rule of law report. It's a lot, but we're going to get into some of that this morning to just kind of understand what all of that means. But to welcome you to the hot seat of the Situation Room first, Dennis is going to tell you which African country he's gone to, and we'd love to get your interpretation of it, the proverb.
Yeah, so today we are in Seychelles. The Seychelles people push the economy through tourism because it is an island country with beautiful beaches. And you talk about another thing because they are an island. Fishing, tuna fishing specifically is what they do, and that contributes to the country's economy. Next time, perhaps let's go down to Seychelles and enjoy what they have to offer. But let's go to our proverb today. And you, being an advocate of the High Court, there's one thing that always comes through: teamwork. And the Seychelles people are telling you teamwork works. How would you interpret that?
I think it's about synergy. Synergy means the sum of the independent parts is more than the individual sum of the parts. So if you have A plus B, the total is A plus B plus X. That is synergy. So teamwork means you're able to bring people together, and what they can accomplish together is more than what each would have accomplished individually. And I think in all circles of professional life and even social life, synergy is the fruit of teamwork. When each person is able to do their own, but they collaborate, the other person is able to bring out something better in you, and you're also able to bring out something better in the other person.
Synergy. A plus B plus X.
The square root of
AB.
I think Wakili, one of the subjects I hated in high school, and I think it was the first one, integers.
You don't like it?
You know integers?
Oh, yes.
Integers was 1, 2, 3,
Yes.
whole numbers.
Whole numbers. One on the number line. Yes.
Formulas.
Clearly, math was not your forte.
But I know how to count money.
You know how to count.
That's
that one
the
you
most
can count.
important thing.
Well done. And you can count your hours of rest. All right. There are many things buzzing, and we're looking into the legal aspect of things this morning. And one of those is the compensation task force that has been set up. We're going to be looking into the legality of it and what exactly it does then mean. But then also, yesterday, what was released was the Rule of Law Kenya report that came out on Katiba Day, and it was done by Lexserv.
Yes.
And in terms of what the rule of law situation in the country actually is. The overview of that report, from what we see, is that it was a product of legal analysis. It was comparative regional assessment, human-centered evaluation. Its purpose was not merely to challenge, but to inspire urgent practical reforms that bridge the gap between constitutional ideals and lived realities. So giving already life to this idea that there's the aspiration of the Constitution, but then there are also realities that Kenya currently lives on. And all of this is hinged together by a hope that the aspiration will become a reality. And because there is the hope, that means it has not been done yet. So the report is hoping that certain things will happen.
Yes.
From this perspective, tell us, because we will then segue from that into now this task force and compensation business.
Okay.
But what the rule of law looks like, because it essentially is constitutionalism, and we are now celebrating Kenya at 15 with a new constitution. So it would appear as though, in terms of the rule of law, there is no satisfaction. Is that the case?
Indeed. In fact, the composite score in that rule of law report is about 53%, which is barely a pass mark. And two of the main sources in coming up with the Kenya Rule of Law report by the Lexserv Trust, which I happen to chair, was the World Justice Project. They do a global rule of law report, which is comparative with data from different countries. And last year, the East African Law Society published East African Law Society Rule of Law report for the East African countries. And this was the second edition that they published, and for the first time they included an index, which means they are trying to measure the performance of the different East African countries. So using those sources and other sources locally, we were able to see how the rule of law stands in Kenya today. And we used 7 key indicators to look at the rule of law. The first is the question of open government, which means how much does governance, is it transparent and accountable to the people? And this is one of the areas where the government of Kenya scores, you could say, fairly, because of the progress in issues like public participation and so on. There's still room for improvement, because important issues like, say, Adani, Standard Gauge Railway, the contracts tend to be hidden from the people, using things like government-to-government contracting. So on that score, Kenya scored a 60%. And then you have access to justice, which is the second score. This relates to judiciary processes, relates to processes of getting justice even through alternative dispute resolution. And here the big challenge that Kenya has, despite the advances over the last 15 years after we got a new constitution, is delays and also corruption associated with the process of seeking justice in the courts or other forums, even police stations, the whole value chain of justice that begins when you report an alleged offense to the police station, if it is criminal or if it is civil, when you seek redress, if it is administrative, there are various other forums. Kenya also scores about 60%, which is fair because the new constitution has broadened the number of organs that you can go to seek redress. Then we have government powers. This is how the government exercises its powers. And again, there have been tremendous constraints on government power institutionally in the new constitution. But there have been several shortcomings. We've seen sometimes we could even call it collusion between the executive and the legislature. We've seen the government ignoring reports of constitutional commissions and so on. So this was a fairly, could say, generous score to give government 60% here. But in the area of fundamental rights and freedoms, even though there has been a very expansive Chapter 4 of the Constitution of Kenya, in fact, it is the longest chapter in the Constitution of Kenya, one of the most progressive in the world. And we have several institutional frameworks, 3 constitutional commissions, the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, the National Gender and Equality Commission, the Commission on Administrative Justice. The courts have been handling many human rights cases. Even those who had violations in the 80s and 90s, some of them went to court and they obtained redress. So there have been positive things. The police are now being overseen by IPOA, Independent Policing Oversight Authority. But despite that progress, we find that human rights violations, some of them very tragic, and things that we thought we had overcome, like extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, abductions, are with us. Denial of access to information, those who are communicating on social media being targeted. So the government gets, or you could say the country gets, a 55% in this area, which means they are below expectation, even though the institutional framework is there. And then the area where the country does the worst is in the anti-corruption efforts, because corruption is as prevalent as it was before 2010, if not more. We are talking about corruption having been devolved even to the counties. And so here Kenya gets a low mark of 35%. When I was in university, the basic pass mark used to be 40. 40 was a D.
So we can even look at you.
So below 40%, you have to resit the exam. So on corruption, we are saying that we need to resit the exam. We are not doing well. We can't move to the next level. And then you have order and security, which has to do with issues of policing, of ensuring that there's peace and security. Kenya scores are 50% because there are still many threats, including some of those I mentioned, like extrajudicial killings. And then regulatory enforcement, Kenya scores are 55. So the overall rating is about 53%, 53.2%, because there's the area of fundamental rights has the biggest weight, and each of those areas has a different weight. So there are various recommendations in this report, and we are hoping that the report will trigger more conversation and dialogue. Where have we gone 15 years down the line? What are the hits? What are the misses? What are the areas we can focus in?
Before you go to the recommendations, then one way to find out what you used as metrics for arriving at these numbers, was it formulaic in nature? We know that research uses things like sampling. We also know that other areas use things like polls. What do you use to arrive at these percentages or arrive at these positions?
So it is a qualitative analysis, and this is benchmarking with the other rule of law reports that are widely respected and recognized. So, for example, the World Justice Project, they use questionnaires and also analyze the data that is there. The East African Rule of Law report, they didn't use much questionnaires, although they spoke to some stakeholders, but they also analyze the institutional arrangements. So in the case of the Lexav Rule of Law report, there was analysis of the scores, comparative scores from the other rule of law reports, and also use of secondary data, because there's a lot of data that is generated. For example, the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics generates a lot of data on a number of metrics. So throughout the report, you'll see several charts and graphs. But at the end of the day, there's a qualitative analysis, which means you have to make a judgment call. When you look at all the available data.
So who do you hold responsible? Sorry, Aseto. Because if we were to do, we usually would read a book in school and then they say, give us a summary of the things that you have read, right? Yes. So if you were to do that summary, and at whose foot would you place the responsibility? Because if we say 53% overall,
yes,
essentially what we're saying is that for the aspirations of the Constitution,
yes,
and the implementation of it so far, you've scored a dismal 53%.
Yes.
But that's not at the foot of one administration. Over the last 15 years, and the responsibility that has been placed at different institutions, groups, arms of government, that this has not happened. So with that summary, essentially we are saying you've not done well with the implementation of this thing.
Exactly.
Whose responsibility then? Who would take it and say, okay, actually, we had an opportunity, we didn't? Who?
So that's an interesting question. And to answer your question, I'll say that there is a dynamic approach that our Constitution takes in Article 10 as well as in Chapter 4. Article 10 is the one that talks of national values and principles of governance. When read together with Article 1 that talks of sovereignty, it starts by saying that sovereignty belongs to the people. And the national values include public participation, accountability. Every person is required to engage in this. When we go to the Chapter 4 on the Bill of Rights, it talks of both vertical and horizontal responsibility and application. So vertical means government is responsible to ensure I enjoy my human rights. But horizontal means that each of us is also responsible to ensure that our fellow citizens or fellow residents in the country enjoy their human rights. So we can't all escape responsibility and say it's just the government. Of course, our primary role as citizens is to elect a government that we believe will implement the Constitution. And of course, there are leadership structures whereby we've also distributed power. It's not all with the president or with parliament. We have constitutional commissions, we have other organs, even arms of government. We have levels of government like county government. So not all power is at the national government. It's not all with the executive, some is with the judiciary. So it's the sum total. When you ask yourself who's responsible, of course, the head of state and government is the president. So in terms of hierarchy of responsibility, you'd say the president bears the most responsibility. And the cabinet, which is, as you could say, the most executive power. But there's also some responsibility for parliament, for the judiciary, for the county governments, for the other arms other organs of government, constitutional commissions and independent offices, even for the citizen. Because corruption, if it is happening, you can't just blame the government. The corruption is happening with the facilitation or involvement of the people. If there is tribalism, it's not just a government issue. The people are taking part in it. So it's for all of us. It's a call to arms for all of us. But more importantly, for us to be able to hold our leaders accountable. Because the time when the citizen is exercising their constitutional office of citizen with the greatest power, we exercise it every day, a constitutional office of citizen that is found in Article 1 and 10 of the Constitution. But on the day we are electing our leaders, that is the day we have the most power to exercise that office. And then the days we are holding them to account, when we are engaging with what media is telling us, the media reports, when we are giving our feedback, sometimes we think that it's only on the day you vote that you can impact the government. But when Kenyans are communicating on social media, when they are giving their opinions to the traditional media or the electronic media, we are also influencing government. They change sometimes their trajectory based on public opinion. So every day that office of citizen can have power. So we also need to hold our leaders more accountable so that they can realize it's no longer business as usual. 2010 was meant to be a paradigm shift, a major change in the way we do governance, but the bad habits keep crawling back, you see. And before we know it, we might find that we're in 2007 or 1997 or 1991. We've seen what has happened with Rigiji's convoy back to the country, how it was being stoned and so on. These are the things that were happening in 1991 with the Forum for Restoration of Democracy, when they were going to Kamkunji grounds. So those bad habits, for them to be back all these years after the new constitution has come in, is an indictment on the government and on all of us.
But Wakili, can the constitution fix bad habits? Because we are looking, the first Bomas draft, I remember, 205, went to a referendum. Chungwa Nandizi, orange bananas.
Yes.
I remember the conversations then because of how the draft was, and it then became very political, that now led to a political movement. Kenyans were saying, look, we are rejecting this thing. Now we have the 2010. Do you think, so my first question was, can the constitution fix bad habits? Because no matter how solid a document you have, we still have a certain culture that cannot be changed just by written words. That's one. Two, do you think it's high time? We have, I'm just thinking wildly, you'll correct me if I'm wrong. So the 2010 constitution, we sat here with Charles Nchai and he said, look, it was addressing an issue that had arisen. We were coming from somewhere, and referred to 1997 and what used to happen then. And then we had the post-election violence and all the political issues that we had. Then it was sort of to, let's take a step back, let's create a document that will address all these historical injustices and political issues. 15 years later, there are a lot of other emerging issues that have come up. There are a lot of gaps. There are hits, misses, but there are also gaps in this document. Is it possible to rethink, okay, after every, 5 years may be little, after every 10 years, let's relook the entire document? Because there's a generation here that is saying, whatever they're reading does not address today's concerns and future concerns. Is that a valid point?
Okay, so those are two very important points, both very weighty, and I'll try to deal with them as best I can. The answer to your first question is, unfortunately, yes and no. Yes, that the Constitution can address bad habits, but it cannot solve all the bad habits. I think there was this American president, the third American president, Thomas Jefferson, during the debate, the constitutional debate, or in the period immediately before, he is attributed to one of the Federalist Papers where he was addressing this question. Can a democracy survive if the people have bad habits? Can it solve their bad habits? And he says for democracy to thrive, the people have to be people of integrity, men and women of integrity, because they're the ones who form the government. They're the ones who choose who will form the government. So there is a sense in which you'd say Constitution cannot fix bad habits that are widespread in the whole population, but there is also a sense in which you can structure governance to take into account the weaknesses of the people. If we know that a head of state tends to accumulate power, grab the power, misuse the power. You can put in place structures to diverse power, to have checks and balances. If you know that the national government tends to forget what is happening in the rest of the country, you can put county government structures so that there are people focusing on county government. If you know that land allocations have been historically misused, as was the case in Kenya, you can put a National Land Commission to take away the presidential discretion in just allocating land, public land. If you know that human rights is an issue in Kenya, you set up a constitutional commission on human rights. You actually have 3. So what I'm saying is that the constitution actually was designed recognizing our historical weaknesses as a people, and it was trying to solve them. So it went to a certain extent to do it, which is good. But at the end of the day, if we are all corrupt, you could say if we are all one-eyed, they say in the country of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. If we are all blind, we will elect the one-eyed man. This is just a proverb. and we will assume that we have got to nirvana. So that's the challenge. It's the interplay between the constitution helping us to grow in virtue, but we have to have virtue so that we can implement constitutionalism. And that comes to your second question. Nabweze, who was a professor of law, talked about what he called constitutions without constitutionalism. That it's not enough to just have a document. Constitutionalism is how you implement the institutional framework, the habits, the processes. So you can have a perfect document. You can keep trying to improve the document to perfect it, but on the ground, vitu ni different. So constitutionalism is now the institutional framework, the legal processes. How aligned are you to what the constitution intended? And then there was this other gentleman who talked about the Grundnorm. And he said that the constitution is meant to be a basic document that's not changed all the time. You change other laws, acts of parliament, but the constitution is like a social contract. That is another philosopher who talked about the social contract. And he said, once you make a social contract, you shouldn't be changing it all the time. You can amend a few things, but avoid wholesale change. The American Constitution, which we like quoting as an example, is more than 200 years old. It has had maybe 20-something amendments over the 200-year period. Our independence constitution lasted for 37 years before we changed it. And we cannot start overhauling a constitution within 15 years. But because the constitution is not perfect, it's a human document, there are some gaps, there are some weaknesses, you can do some small amendments. And our history is that when you open the constitution to major amendments, then politicians and people with self-interest, I'm not saying it's only politicians, anyone with self-interest can just come and take advantage of the opportunity to change what was a consensus document. Do you remember how much time we spent debating whether we'll have parliamentary, presidential, hybrid system?
Yes.
And how we reached a compromise? And I remember the time when Raila Odinga came and said, no, we don't need to have a prime minister. Who said that my position is we must have a prime minister? There was a compromise that got us a constitution. So now, to go back to that whole contestation about the system of government, should we bring back assistant ministers that we removed from our cabinet, from our constitution and from the cabinet, is like going backwards. It's like before you truly implemented the constitution, you already started saying, let's change it.
But isn't that where we're heading with the current conversation now, politically speaking?
Yeah, so for me, I've always thought that there are aspects of the constitution that may need to be changed. Honestly, even in 2010, I was a part of the no side of the constitution because I had concerns with a few provisions. And I think as Kenyans, we said, let's first implement the constitution for 5 years, see where the shoe is pinching before we decide that the shoe doesn't fit very well. But then I noticed that when I listened to the political conversation, the issues that they are more focused on amending are the issues where Kenyans tend to already have a strong consensus. For example, we don't want a bigger parliament. We already think 290 elective constituencies with the other 47 women MPs already is big enough for the National Assembly.
True.
We think the Senate is big enough. When you listen to MPs, That's one of the things they want to change. They want to increase the number of constituencies because they are concerned about the implications of the population census on boundary delimitation and the fact that some of them might lose, in quotes, their constituencies because some counties will have fewer constituencies than others. You see? The issue of, for example, funds going to the counties, it has been a debate, and there's a minimum of 15%. We don't even need an amendment, assuming you want to increase the allocation to 20%. The Constitution says minimum. But you can see every time the counties are trying to get more money through the Council of Governors or through the Senate, there's pushback from the Treasury. So I have looked at some of the areas where they want to amend. They want to now bring Office of Prime Minister back. And yet they are not changing the system of government from presidential to parliamentary. It's like a bastardized outcome that they are looking for, just to have more, you could say, seats or positions for the boys and the girls. These days is the boys and the girls.
Yes.
So I think there's room for legitimate constitutional amendments, but we have to be cautious that the constitutional moment is not hijacked by those who want to undo the compromise that was to favor good governance. So MPs want to have CDF entrenched in the constitution. This surprisingly is one of the areas where I see on the ground the people find CDF helping them. CDF is actually popular on the ground.
Yes.
It's unpopular with us, you could say the governance elite, who believe it is not aligned to the structure of the constitution. But on the ground, it's popular. And the Supreme Court has said CDF is unconstitutional for whatever reason. To bring CDF into the constitution, to entrench in the constitution, you'll need a referendum if it passes parliament. If it passes the Senate, you'll need a referendum. And that means the people will have the final word. If that is all you are amending, you are doing something that is limited. It's almost like you are not opening up the whole abdomen when you are doing your surgery.
Yeah.
You are doing something small. Then those ones can be tolerated. Those are the kind of constitutional amendments that should happen. But not the one where it's like you're doing a big revamp to the document. It's like a car which has not even traveled a long distance and you want to do complete engine overhaul or change the engine, change everything. No, it just needs a service, either minor service or major service.
So actually we look at the constitution, and you started by saying that there is the constitution, but then there is constitutionalism, which is really important. And if you look at the country that is Kenya, we have thrown blame to corruption. Those guys are corrupt. Yes. But then again, there is the giver, there is the taker, there is the participation of the locals, of Kenyans in this in corruption. And you look at some of the recommendations that that the report has given are protecting the civic space. There is institutionalized participation, require MDAs and counties to publish participation. But then you look at all these, and the government itself, in terms of even giving funds to the counties, is 15% of the last audited accounts. Which last audited accounts are we dealing with right now? It's 2023. Yes. So in terms of even just abiding by the law, we are not doing that. But then how do we change the conversation such that Kenyans consume the constitution and entrench constitutionalism in them to understand what's at stake for them?
Okay, that's a good question. Apart from being in this organization called the Lexav Trust that has produced a rule of law report, I also happen to chair the Kenya Christian Professionals Forum, which interestingly was also founded about 15 years ago. Just 2 weeks after we promulgated the new constitution, we'll also be commemorating our 15th anniversary. And in KCPF, one of our pillars is governance, advocacy, and reflection on governance and how the people, as per your question, can engage more in governance. And one of the proposals we have right now is to have what we are calling a governance accountability program, whereby we digest the information that you're already getting from constitutional commissions and independent offices, because the watchdog organs of government are struggling, despite challenges, to do their job. They are churning out very useful reports, but the citizen is not aware. Reports about corruption, reports about human rights, reports about land, everything is being churned out. In fact, it's only occasionally Auditor General reports are highlighted by the media, the ones which are a bit more dramatic and maybe may have a bit more sensationalism. But there are many other reports. So we feel that if we empower the citizen, so that the citizen is aware of what is happening, then they'll have the ammunition to hold their leaders to account. And we feel that that is where one of the big gaps is. The gap is that information, even that is churned out, is not digested sufficiently to the citizen. This requires a partnership of both the mainstream media and also the social media, as well as other civil society organizations, faith-based institutions, to engage the citizen on the ground. And this is the only way, even when we come to elections, our elections can rise beyond being a contest on ethnicity and personality to a contest about development, ideas, and issues.
Right.
Yeah.
So one of the ways in which we see this living out currently is the most recent announcement by the president that there would be a task force committee that would deal with the compensation for victims of many things, and that these many things should have been protected in the Constitution. The safeguarding of human rights, for example, the right to life, the right to then be able to be protected by the country. When we look at different protectionist strategies that the government uses, had that stood in place when people were shot during protests, when people were disappeared without any kind of reason, when people again were disappeared and were failed, and the system failed to bring them before a court to level any charges against them. Another thing that is recommended, not even recommended or suggested, demanded of by the Constitution. And that these things haven't happened, and that Kenyans are up in arms because those constitutional provisions have been abrogated. That is clear. But they've not been addressed. How we want to address them now is by a compensation committee that will then say, and from what we assume, we don't even know what it's going to be. We assume that it's going to be a monetary compensation, that some amount of money will be given to the family of a daughter who was killed, or a son who was shot, or a husband who never came home. That this will happen. So before we even start to look at the details and what the law requires to be done, does this first of all constitutionally make sense to have a committee of this nature to address those issues before we even look at the wheretofores?
That's a very profound question, because it has been an issue of contestation in legal circles in the last few days. And I've been in debates with some of my colleagues, or discussions, some of my legal colleagues on this particular issue. So first of all, let me tell you what are the positions that are being taken on the topic. There are those who feel that our principal institutional framework in the Constitution to address compensation is the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, as well as processes beginning with the police, the Director of Public Prosecution, and the judiciary, so that you assign responsibility or liability, and then in terms of compensation, you do investigation, you present it to the court for assessment of damages. So there are some people who feel that this task force that has been set aside pursuant to a presidential proclamation that there have been human rights violations in the course of protests is undermining the integrity of existing institutional arrangements. There is another group also of lawyers who believe that we are nitpicking when we start making these statements, because under Article 131 of the Constitution and Article 132, the President has been given several roles and functions, including to safeguard human rights and fundamental freedoms and secure the rule of law. And that the President also has a role in the human rights, you could say, architecture. And that if the President decides to establish a team of advisors as a task force to assist him expedite the process of compensation, then that is something that should be celebrated, because the outcome is that the victims might have to wait 2-3 years for the normal processes to take place, and who knows whether they will even succeed. So my own view of the matter is that we need to have a balance. Because I have listened very carefully to those who have said, let's follow the existing institutional arrangements. And I have not seen the light at the end of the tunnel. I have not seen on what day will that victim of abduction, torture, or the family whose son or daughter was killed, when will they get compensation? I have not seen it. On the other hand, I also acknowledge that if you just allow the president to do anything and everything he wants, there is a danger. And so my feeling is that if you have a task force, but it is subject to interventions by Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, who should play a role in the process, it is subject to parliamentary oversight, to judicial review, then it is a mechanism that may work and may set a precedent. Because you see, what is very important for me is that there is a precedent, so that those who are victims in maybe 2017, who are victims in 2012, can also get compensation. Of course, there are some who are saying, why are you discriminating and now focusing only the people who were victimized in the last 2 years? I was in a discussion with someone who said, but we've had victims since 1963.
Sure.
And I think my own response to that was to say, surely, if we are going to treat these people the way we treat pending bills of government, where you say verify, and then it takes 10 years, there's no budget, then at least let's compensate these ones, and that creates a precedent for future compensation. So there's something called complementary mechanism. Complementary means the moment you follow one route, it doesn't forgo or forestall, it doesn't exclude your ability to follow another route. So you can get the compensation by the executive, and if you want to seek review for additional compensation, or you want criminal liability and there's a criminal investigation, it doesn't stop those processes. So my own view after listening to the various sides of the argument is that I would prefer if we give a chance to the task force to see what they are going to do. There could be some amendments to the institutional arrangements, especially to secure a stronger role for the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. But let's give them a chance. If we can get compensation within 3 months for these people, we judge the process as well as the outcome.
Wakili, there are those who look at it from a different perspective, that the fact that there is a task force that has been put in place to look at these, in a way, is admittance by the government that there is an illegality that took place. The government is admitting, fine, there are people who died in the hands of police, and we agree that that happened. There are those who look at it in terms of, if this is allowed to continue, every other government, because we've set a precedent, will see no need of respecting human life, of respecting the Bill of Rights. They will go about killing people as we want. We'll go about curtailing the rights given by the Constitution, because we know at the end of the day, we will form another committee who will compensate the victims, and life moves on. How would you respond to that?
Okay, first point, I fully agree that it is an admission by the government that there was violations, and that government organs were responsible, or at least partially responsible. And whenever there are violation of human rights, the first level of responsibility of government is failure in their duty to protect. Even if they were not the active organ and they failed to protect, to provide security, they failed. I remember many years back when I was a younger lawyer representing a client who was suing the Nairobi City Council, as it then was, because this client was walking and fell into a manhole. They didn't have a manhole cover. It was not City Hall that removed the manhole cover, but the fact that they failed to ensure the streets were safe. We sued City Hall. So that was failure in their duty to make the streets safe. So that is the first level of responsibility, and nobody questions that government is responsible for failure in their duty to protect. The second is the active perpetrator who perpetrated, and there's this principle of the line of command. Can you attribute responsibility up the line of command? And this, of course, would require more investigation. to determine what happened. And it may be, and probably is so, that there were agents of government who were involved in these unlawful actions, and we need to find who they were and to hold them responsible. But even if it was one agent of government, the entire government is responsible, so they need to protect. So that's the answer to the first question. The government is accepting liability, and that is true. In fact, it is very good that they accept liability. The worst thing would be if they keep denying liability while we also with our eyes what happened. The second issue is whether this will be a blank check to future governments to violate human rights. Let me put it this way. If my human rights have been violated, or even if it is just civil, since I'm a lawyer, my time is spent representing people in court. Somebody has breached a contract. Somebody has committed a tort, which is like negligence or accident against me. I seek compensation against them because I'm a victim. In my process of seeking compensation, you can't say, no, if they compensate you, you'll be giving an open door check for them to breach future contracts. In fact, there's a mechanism in law that is called aggravated and even exemplary damages, whereby to make that person not do it again, when the court gives compensation, sometimes it enhances the compensation so that the person feels the pain, and in future they will think twice about doing it. But you can't stop me from being compensated out of fear that in future someone else will come for compensation. I'm a victim. I need to be compensated today. So it's true. Government might view it as a permission for the future, and that is where you need complementary mechanisms to hold responsible the individuals who are actual perpetrators or who have chain of command responsibility over the actions that took place.
So,
unfortunately, the last time the president tried to establish a commission of inquiry, judicial commission of inquiry, which was on Shakahola, the matter was taken to court, and the court found the commission of inquiry to be unconstitutional for a number of reasons, including the fact that a judge was part of the commission of inquiry. There was a questioning of whether the president had powers to do that. So a commission of inquiry would have been the best to investigate responsibility when you have large-scale violations. Or you would have something like what we did after the post-election violence of 2007-2008, where we established a committee of inquiry, and it came up with a report, you remember, about the causes of the post-election violence. But nonetheless, whatever outcome any other body comes with has to be now processed through the criminal justice system. The police take the complaint, investigate further, ensure that they have evidence beyond reasonable doubt against certain suspects, take it to the DPP. The DPP arranges it, takes it to the court. Then there is a judicial trial, because the right to fair hearing applies to everyone.
But okay, there lies the problem. I mean, I'm hearing what you're saying, and in principle, that is ideally what should happen.
Yes.
And that is what must happen. But let's look at the Kenya reality. The Kenyan reality is, there's somebody who said, if you want to cook ugali, you don't start by putting flour first. Then stir the flour, then add the water. You add the water, let the water boil, then add flour, then start stirring and make the ugali. In our case here, we are jumping the gun and saying, look, you were shot or you lost your son, so let me pay you for the death of your son. There is no element of goodwill to say, I'm taking responsibility, because even in this case, there's no admission that we are admitting we are responsible. There's nothing like that. It almost appears that the semblance of saying I'm going to pay you is saying I'm admitting that there's something wrong, but they're not outrightly saying that right from the top. In this case, there needs to be accountability. Who shot my son or my daughter? Let's establish that first. By the time you're even having discussions, or they can actually be parallel, have this conversation around compensation, but at the same time, you start seeing the wheels of justice spinning against the perpetrators of this. Now, when we talk about a commission of inquiry, in the history of this country, I'm not old, I'm young, but in my I've remembered several commission of inquiries in questionable accidents that feature prominent people, injustices of mass scale like this one, and a report is tabled. Then a report is presented to State House. Pictures are taken. Several reports are shared. The media is given those reports. And they gather dust on shelves, and the story dies there. You don't see anything happening. You don't see heads rolling or heads spinning. It ends up in a document called a report.
Yes.
And it stops there. That's the problem.
In fact,
it's not just another one.
So you've actually said two things, and you have made very valid points. And I'll try to respond to both. So on the first issue about the need for accountability, the terms of reference of this task force is not just to pay people money, it's also to investigate in general the circumstances and make recommendations. And my hope is that whatever recommendations they make will be taken up by the organs that are in the Constitution and in our law that are now meant to ensure accountability takes place. So that is the hope, that the two things should actually proceed concurrently. The task force should not just be for compensation, but also to determine the circumstances in which it happened and to make recommendations against it. But your second point was an even more weighty point, which is that when the president is the one who has established the task force or the commission of inquiry, he is the ultimate consumer of the report. He can take the report and put it on the shelf because he doesn't like it. Or halfway through the preparation of the report, maybe some of the members of that team are his friends and they are not liking the trajectory of the report, and maybe even they interfere halfway through with the contents of the report. And that's the danger when it is presidential driven. You need checks and balances through other institutional structures. One of the things that we could possibly explore, for example, is a judicial-led process. This is what we call an inquest, which is led by the judiciary. An inquest normally is done over suspicious deaths or accidental unexplained deaths in certain circumstances. We've not explored the possibility of an inquest that is wide-ranging, where there are several deaths involved. That is something that could be tried, but that would have to be the judiciary, and maybe the Commission on Human Rights could attempt to begin such a process that could be led by the judiciary. Parliament also has its own processes. They establish committees, sometimes special committees. They go to the ground. Like when Shakahola happened, the Senate established a committee chaired by Danson Mungatana. And they went to the ground and they came up with a report. So the other arms of government can also do their thing. But if none of them are doing anything at that broad scale, the executive should also try. And it doesn't mean that if one tries, the other cannot try. I remember I was appointed to the Presidential Task Force on Religious Organizations. I was appointed by the President. But at the same time, as we were looking at religious extremism, Shakahola was being studied by the Senate. So it doesn't mean when you have one mechanism, it excludes all the others. You understand? In fact, to tell people, no, you don't do it, it should be the other one, you end up with nobody doing it. We all knew somebody should do it. Anybody could have done it, but nobody did it. You see?
So, it's interesting. I mean, and just tying into that there are too many examples of, these reports. There's so many commissions that came into being until today. The supposed compensation that's supposed to happen barely has. One of the things about a Truth and Justice Reconciliation Commission, whether you want to look at one that was, seen over in South Africa or one that was in Rwanda, was that there had to be an admittance of, we know what happened, right? And that is how true restoration then started. Nobody's saying it was going to be complete. But I want to come back to one of the bodies that you talked about, the Kenya Human Rights, the Kenya National Human Rights
Kenya
Commission.
National Commission
on Human Rights. Why not use that body? Because this is what they do anyway. Why not use that body as opposed to now forming another task force, another committee to start to deliberate all over again? Why not use the folks whose job it is anyway to do this?
I actually spoke to a senior officer at the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights very recently, and I asked him a question about this task force. And one of the things that I learned from them is they have concerns about institutional support, including resources, finances. so that they can increase their capacity, expand, and have effective offices all over the country. So, of course, they don't have the level of support that they need to have. And actions like this one of establishing complementary mechanisms may actually contribute to undermining even their own institutional strength.
Absolutely.
It's like
You're saying they can't do their job.
Yes, it's like in 1964 when our founding president Jomo Kenyatta was not happy with the structure of federalism or majimbo. He engineered a mechanism of denying them funds and resources, so that a few years later he could say that the majimbo system was not working, and everyone then abandoned it. So it was not working because it was deliberately made not to work. So you are right that the more we establish other mechanisms, the more it allows us, in quotes, to deny the existing institutional frameworks of the resources, the support they need to do the job independently. However, we also need to realize that real politic means that sometimes when you get the door slightly ajar by the people in the executive, you take advantage of the opportunity.
And get in the door.
So you get in. Because if you then slam the door shut, the other one will not open. So that's the idea of complementarity. Use all angles that you can to try and get redress for the victims.
As well, one important aspect would be, as we deal with all these complementing institutions, there's the need to embed the command responsibility so as to ensure those with the responsibility protect their bases so that we don't find ourselves in this position. How critical is that?
Yeah, the doctrine of command responsibility, which has been explored at the International Criminal Court, or ICC. You remember one of the Kenyans in the Kenya case who was charged at ICC was head of police and was claimed to have been responsible. Of course, the cases were eventually dismissed. But that is a doctrine that has been discussed in international law forums. In Kenya, we also have the International Crimes Act, which domesticates the Rome Statute. So the doctrine of command responsibility needs to be explored more in Kenya. And I believe it is the way to go. When you find senior people in the police service or in the Ministry of Interior giving orders that are patently unconstitutional, like shoot to kill, which seems to be beyond even the police standing guidelines or the force guidelines, then there has to be some element of command responsibility that comes into play. But I also have to remind the listeners that one of the very important provisions in Kenya, in fact, it is a provision that cannot be limited or derogated from, is Article 50, the right to a fair trial. It's part of the right to a fair hearing. And you cannot derogate from it. So even that person who you claim has command responsibility has to be given their day in court. And you have to come with evidence beyond reasonable doubt. You cannot eliminate that process and just find the person guilty. And they will have their defense. And you'll need to come up with a strong case against them. And probably it requires strong institutions. Maybe an institution that, like the Law Society of Kenya, can collaborate with the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights to initiate this kind of process. Because these are institutions that have a fair amount of independence from the government players who may be responsible under the doctrine of command responsibility. So there's a lot to be done, but it is not something that will be done easily or will take a short period of time.
All right. This is it. Because, and this is, honestly, Wakili, I wish you would come more often. And I know that you're wrapped up in a lot of this all the time, but for us to be able to unfold and unpack a lot of these things is absolutely necessary learning, but at the same time keeping the conversations front and center. It would be interesting to see what happens in the coming days. 53% is not a good mark, coming back to that LACSERV report, but maybe Kenya will get towards, higher percentages. But then obviously we see these playing out again in the committees, like things we've talked about today. So for us to all be involved in constitutionalism, I guess, is the point that we're all striving for. And that's a long-winded way of saying thank you for being here this morning, and we're looking forward to more conversations with you. Asante sana.
It was my pleasure, and my parting shot is the constitutional office of the citizen. Let's take it seriously, because at the end of the day, the constitution is structured so that sovereignty begins with and ends with the people.
Indeed. Good morning.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.